today's video, we're going to talk about lighting, reflection volumes, and post-process volumes. And we're going to take our forest stream scene from looking like this to looking like this. So buckle up, this is going to be a cool ride, and we're going to talk about some features that can make a really big difference in your scene. Let's start off with lighting. When it comes to lighting in an outdoor daylight scene, you're pretty much just using the directional light. That's the light that I have selected here. And the directional light can be rotated, but moving it around the scene doesn't really matter very much because it's always coming from one constant direction. The thing that you have to decide is my scene going to be a dynamic scene with the time of day changing? Or is it going to be a static scene where I can pick the sun angle and leave it there and have it be there constantly? I know that everybody's a big fan of having dynamic time of day, but it's actually something really complicated to set up and makes creating your scene significantly more complex. You have to balance all kinds of different factors for the scene looking good at all of the different times of day. And it's more expensive. If you have a light that's moving, it's significantly more expensive than when it's static. So what I'd recommend for your scene is that you, on your directional light, let's just jump over to our directional light now. So in my scene, it's here. It doesn't really matter where you place it in the scene. It's only the direction that matters. If I press the E key, I can rotate my directional light and get the light coming from the direction that I want. And so that's what you're going to want to decide. I recommend that you pick a static light, which means you're going to set it to static right here. And then you're going to rotate the light until you get it to an angle that you think is best. Now, lighting is generally more beautiful if you can get the sun coming from kind of a horizontal angle. If you set the light to come from straight down like it's noon, you're going to get significantly shorter shadows and lighting that is quite a bit more flat. And so what I recommend is that you select an angle that is a little bit more on the horizon. Now, one issue with this is the longer your shadows are, the more expensive shadows are to render. And so you don't want to go too far, but maybe strike a good compromise between straight down at noon and 90 degrees right on the horizon at dusk. You want to find a good balance between those two, maybe something in between 45 and 55 degrees. All right, once you've set your sun angle, then you're going to want to bake your lighting. So here it says lighting needs to be rebuilt, 264 unbuilt objects. Whenever you move a light around, you're going to get that. Or whenever you move objects that have baked lighting, your lighting is going to need to be rebuilt. And that is kind of a hassle. But the way that you do it is you come up here to build and you drop this down and you can pick lighting quality. Now, when you're in the middle of building your scene, I recommend setting lighting quality to medium just so that your bake time won't take very long. But what I'm going to do this time, since I know that I'm not going to be moving objects around in my scene very much from here on out, I'm going to set my lighting to production. And then I'm just going to hit build. And what this is going to do is it's going to start building my lighting. Now, when I did my video on ray traced global illumination, I had a lot of people ask me, is it possible to do this ray traced global illumination and then bake the results? And the answer is yes. And that's what I'm doing right now. I'm actually using Unreal's built-in lighting system called Light Mass, and it is basically creating global illumination for me and baking it. So I'm not paying the cost of ray traced real-time global illumination, but I'm baking the results of it into my light maps. And because I set my quality to production, it's going to take a while. So I'm just going to go ahead and pause it and come back when it's done. All right, our light build is done. And what you can see right away is that there's significantly less detail in our shadows. Whereas before we could make out individual leaves from our tree in the shadows, now our shadow is just kind of like one big blob. And the reason for that is that the dynamic shadow maps that we render are significantly higher resolution than the light maps that we just baked. Now, one thing that you may notice is if we look at our frames per second counter over here, we're up to almost 60 frames a second, which means that the static shadow maps that we just baked are significantly more efficient at rendering than the real-time dynamic shadow maps. But we're losing a lot of detail. And we may be able to improve this if we increase the resolution of our baked light maps, but that would be at the cost of increased texture memory usage as well. So whether or not you're going to use baked light maps or dynamic shadow maps is pretty much up to you. In my case, I think I'm going to pay the extra cost and switch my light to be to use the dynamic shadow maps instead. I'm going to switch my light source to be stationary, and you can see immediately that I get way more detail because our dynamic shadow maps are significantly higher resolution. But again, you can see that my frames per second has dropped down to 44 FPS instead of around 60, and that's just because the dynamic shadow maps are significantly more expensive to render. All right, the next thing that I want to talk about are light probe volumes or reflection volumes. And I have set up reflection capture volumes in this folder here. You can see I've added sphere reflection capture objects to the scene. And to do that, we just open up our place actors window and we can type in reflection capture. You can see I have box reflection captures, planar reflection captures, and sphere reflection captures. And what these do is they capture a cube map at the location that I place the sphere. So let me show you, I'm just going to place one of these into the scene and show you what it does. So here's a sphere reflection capture object. I'm going to drag it from the place actor window into my scene. And what this is going to do is wherever I put it, it's going to render a cube map from this location. And the influence of this cube map is going to be set by this influence radius. So right now it's set to 3000, which is going to be 30 meters, but I can adjust this value so it's significantly smaller or significantly larger. And you can see as I move it in, it has a nice spherical widget around it, so you can see the extent of its influence. I want to show you two problems that we're trying to solve with these reflection volumes. First of all, if I'm looking at my water and I look at it kind of at a grazing angle, you can see that this rock is reflected in the water here. And you can also see this tree here off in the distance. Let's see if I can get the tree in the reflection. Yeah, this tree here is reflected in the water here. And that's using screen space reflection. However, if these objects that I want to reflect are no longer on the screen, they're also no longer reflected. So I don't see the tree in the water if I'm looking at it like this. I actually have to have the tree on the screen. So when the tree is off the screen, I can only reflect the sky in this spot here in the middle. But as I rotate up, then the tree fades into view and now I'm reflecting the tree. But what I'd really like to do is to be able to reflect the tree whenever it's supposed to show up in the reflection, regardless of whether the tree itself is on the screen or not. And in order to do that, I have a couple of choices. I can either use ray tracing or I can use these sphere or box reflection captures and capture cube maps to use for reflections. The other problem that I have, and this is especially noticeable in shadow areas, is that in this area where I've made the ground wet with my wetness decal that we talked about last week, I get this really weird blue tone around everything, like underneath this rock here and above the rock. And that's because the reflections in this area are captured using the sky. But really, the sky should be shadowed by this tree here. So in shadow, I shouldn't be able to see the sky or reflect the sky. But I am using the sky reflection. The reflection for my whole scene, when I don't have sphere reflection capture or box reflection capture, is coming from my sky light. And that's just capturing the sky, basically. So, but these objects here really should be reflecting each other instead of reflecting the sky. The sky is going to be blue and give it this blue halo, but I need a much more realistic looking reflection. And so, I'm going to grab my reflection capture that I created over here, and I'm going to move it over to the area that we're looking at and see what happens to that blue halo around everything when I have an actual reflection volume. Now, did you see that? When I move the reflection volume into this area, now I'm getting much more realistic and appropriate looking reflections than I did when I didn't have it. Here, I'll move it away. You can see that now I'm reflecting the sky. And now when I move it close, I'm using the reflection that this is capturing instead of the overall scene reflection. And my reflection capture is set to 3.4 meters, so it has a relatively small radius. You can see that our scene looks really nice here, but over here where we're outside of the radius, it starts to break down again. And so what I need to do is place these reflection capture spheres throughout my scene, kind of at the level where my camera is going to be. The most accurate capture location is right at the middle of one of these points. And so I want to put these not down low like this, because my camera is generally not going to be there. I want to put them about 6 or 8 feet in the air around the level where my camera is going to be. So as my camera passes through them, it'll get the most accurate reflections that I can give it. And so I've gone ahead and done that. And I've placed these reflection capture volumes all along my stream bed. I'm just going to select all of them and we're going to take a look. I'll zoom way out here so you can see. And so now you can see I've got these reflection captures volumes placed all along my stream bed. Now, I started out placing these volumes that have the larger radius and kind of evenly spacing them. So here's one, and then here's the next one over here, and then the next one. But then I realized that I needed a little bit more resolution than that. So I placed in between the larger ones. So here's one right here, and here's another large one here. But then I went back and I put a smaller one halfway in between each of the larger ones. So here's a smaller one. And if I zoom in on this, so you'll notice that this is about 6 feet off the ground, and it's placed right about the height that my camera is going to be when my player character runs by. And you can see if I toggle this on and off, I get significantly more realistic reflections in this area. So let's take a look at what that gives us. So if I've got my camera here in this spot and I toggle my reflection capture volumes off, now you can see I'm just reflecting the sky, and none of the local objects in this area are actually reflected in the water. But when I turn it on, I get much more realistic looking reflections. Now, one of the features of these reflection volumes is an intensity setting. So you have the influence radius, where you can say how big the reflection volume itself is going to be. But then there's also this brightness value. And right now I've got all of these set to 10. That may actually be a little bit high. So I'm going to select all of these and let's set them down to 1. This may be a little bit more realistic, or if you want it to brighten things up, maybe set it to 2 or 3. And you can play around with those results and see what gives you the best outcome. But yeah, so it's important to place these reflection capture points around your scene. Not only so that you can get rid of that blue halo that was around objects, but also so that you can reflect objects like this tree without the tree actually having to be on the screen. So pretty cool, and it makes a really big difference to the quality of the reflections. I'll toggle these on and off again. So now I'm only reflecting the sky, and now I'm actually using the reflections that the sphere reflection capture objects are grabbing for the objects that are local right around. So pretty cool. All right, up next we're going to take a look at the post-process volume. There are a ton of settings in here, and basically these are operations that happen after the main part of the scene has been rendered, and they happen to the whole scene or the whole rendered frame, and that's why they're called post-process, because it's something that's happened after the rendering has already occurred. So if we scroll down here, you can see that there are all kinds of different effects going on: lens, color grading, film, render features, etc. So I'm going to go through these one at a time and show you what they do. But first I just want to show you, right now the post-process volume is disabled, and I can turn it on, and you can see that it just adds a significant amount of richness and just an extra layer of cool factor to the scene. Now the reason it's called a post-process volume is because it's scaled to a specific size and surrounding a specific area on my map. And whatever is inside that volume will receive the post-process effects. Right now I have it set to infinite extent, unbounded, which means it's going to ignore the volume size and just apply to the whole scene everywhere. But if you want various post-process volumes, say like you want something to look different when it's indoors versus outdoors, or you have a part of your scene that you want to look warm and a different part that you want to look cold, you can set the size of these post-process volumes and surround just the areas that you want to affect. In my case, I want my whole scene to have relatively the same mood, and so I just have this box checked for unbounded so that it gets applied everywhere. All right, let's go ahead and turn this on, and I am going to run you through the settings and show you what this is doing. So first of all, let's take a look at lens effects. First we have bloom, and I just have it set to the standard method as opposed to convolution. You can see from the tooltip on convolution that that method is too expensive for games, so we're just going to avoid that. What bloom does, and if I turn it off, I don't know if you can actually see it because I have it kind of dialed into a kind of a subtle effect, but maybe we'll be able to see it better if we look at the sun actually. All right, so we're looking at the sun, and you can see that there's just like this really bright spot that kind of overcasts the scene. And if I set the bloom intensity to 0, you can see that that bright spot glows away. So that's kind of what bloom is doing. It's making really bright areas of the scene glow and kind of overshadow other areas of the scene. So I have my intensity set to 6. I could set it down to 1 for less bloom, or higher for more. And then this threshold determines the brightness that an object has to be before it will actually bloom. If I come down here, you can see I've got a white rock. And if I turn my threshold down to something like 0.1, you'll notice that now the rock is blooming as well. But I have that threshold value set to 8 so that normal parts of the scene won't bloom. But so when I look at the sun, it does. And that creates a really nice sun effect without actually blooming other objects. So I like to set my intensity relatively high, but my threshold high as well, so that objects that I do want to bloom get a lot of bloom, but then objects that shouldn't bloom, like rocks, don't. All right, my next setting is exposure. And you can see again there is a drop down for the different types of exposure. There's basic and then auto exposure histogram. Basic calculates the exposure in a really simple way, so it's cheaper, but the auto exposure histogram method is much more accurate because it's actually metering on a larger portion of the screen. And so what this is doing is it's acting exactly like exposure does with a film camera, where it tries to figure out the overall brightness of the scene and balance the brightness and the darks, the brights and the darks of the screen, so that those are in balance. If my exposure is too low, then my scene is all going to be too dark. And if it's too high, my scene's going to be too bright. And so this exposure setting is allowing the game engine to automatically balance my scene. Now, if I feel like it's making my scene too bright or too dark, I can use this exposure compensation setting to increase the exposure after it's already been tuned. So if I want it to be really bright, I can go up a couple of f-stops. This is 2 f-stops up. And you can see I'm getting a pretty bright scene here. Or if I want kind of a dark and moody scene, I can set my exposure compensation to be negative, and then I get some really nice dark darks in my scene. In my case, I thought a value of 0.5 was pretty good, so I'm going to leave it at that. All right, the next thing that I want to show you is min brightness and max brightness. Let's take a look at these. So right now I've got a min brightness of 0.01. And let's just change this to 0.1 to see what happens. You can see that now my scene is significantly more dark. And that's because my min brightness is preventing my exposure compensation from going down lower than 0.1. If I want to be able to brighten up my shadows when I'm in shadow, then I need to set this value fairly low so that shadow areas can be bright. But if I set this value higher, if we set it to 0.5 for example, this shadow area is going to stay dark and not be compensated. So I will still have decent bright areas, but shadow values are going to stay dark like this. And so if I want those areas to be well lit, I need to make sure that I give that value a low enough range so that the exposure compensation can change the brightness of the scene to compensate for the dark shadow areas. And it's the same thing with max brightness. If I keep this value low, then when I'm looking at something really bright like the sun, it's just going to stay really bright. But if I change this value to something really high, then my sunlight area is the exposure is gonna brighten up to match those high areas. And I like to keep these values in a range of 0.01 and 8, and those work well for this particular scene. But if you've got a scene that has like really low light or really, really bright light, you may have to use values other than these. Now I don't use these very much, but we have speed up and speed down, which control how fast the exposure compensation happens. But right now they're set to something that relatively matches the way that your eye works. So I'm just gonna leave them there. All right, the next setting that we have is chromatic aberration. And this is trying to mimic the effect of kind of a cheap camera lens. But what I find is it makes the scene feel just a little bit more cinematic, and it's kind of a subtle thing. And so I'm going to turn this up just so you can see what it's doing. So I have it set to an intensity of 1. And what you'll notice is that around the edges of the scene, you get these red fringes around the edges of things. And the color in the scene is kind of pulling itself apart. So you get red fringe on one side and blue fringe on the other side. And this is a sampling, or this is mimicking the effect of refraction in the camera lens, where different wavelengths of light are refracted slightly differently. A really good camera lens will do some things to mitigate this effect. And so if you want to tell yourself that, oh, I'm shooting my scene with a really expensive camera lens, then you could set the chromatic aberration to 0, and you'd end up with a really sharp scene. But I like to put just a little bit of chromatic aberration into my scene because I feel like it makes it look a little bit more realistic, like it's being filmed by a real camera, and it kind of removes the edge of video gaminess from the image that I'm creating. So I've got my chromatic aberration intensity set to 0.3. All right, the next setting that we have is lens flares. And boy, I could spend like a whole video talking about lens flares, but I'm not gonna do that today. Let's just look at our sun, and you can see that when I look at the sun, there's this flare that comes off of it. And this is to mimic the effect of light leaking inside the lens and kind of bouncing around inside the camera lens. So if I set my lens flare intensity to 0, you can see it goes away. If I set it to 0.01, I get a little bit lighter flare. And if I set it to 4, I get like a really dark, heavy flare. I'm just gonna set this to 0.01 and leave it there. I'm not gonna get too much into lens flares today, but just wanted to show you that that setting was available to tune. And there are a ton of settings in here if you want to customize your lens flare. All right, the next thing that we have is depth of field. And this is the way that the scene becomes blurry off in the distance. Can you see how this tree way off in the distance is kind of slightly out of focus? There are a couple of different settings we have here for controlling the depth of field. The first is the focal distance, and this is how far away from the camera we want the scene to be in focus. So I have my scene in focus about 8 meters away. If I set this to, let's set this to like 50, which is like half a meter. So anything that's half a meter or closer will be in focus, like this rock, but then everything else will be out of focus. You might want to do that in a cinematic or something, but usually you want your focal distance to be at the player or a little bit past the player. And so I'm going to set this to 800 again. And then this depth blur radius is how much the items in the far background are blurred. Or it could also be described as the radius in pixels of how far that blur goes. So if I set this to something crazy like 200, you can see that the background of my scene is kind of at an extreme blur. I like to keep this at something a little more reasonable, like 20. Now, if you are seeing that your post-process effects are making a hit on your performance, like right now my performance is at about 40, you can turn off depth of field, and that will improve your performance a little bit. So as I set my focal distance from 800 down to 0, my FPS went from 40 up to 47. So that did actually make quite a big difference here. But for now, I'll leave it on just because it's kind of pretty, and it also helps to focus the player's view kind of in the near ground and to kind of blend out what's happening in the background. Okay, next we have color grading, and this allows you to just do some subtle adjustments. Well, you can make some really drastic adjustments if you want to, but in my case, I'm using color grading to just make some subtle adjustments to the color in my scene. Let me see if I can find a good place where we can see a good example of this. What I like to do with color grading, and this is just my own personal preference, I like to set the saturation of my shadows up to 1.5. And if I just turn this off, I don't know if you can even see what's happening there. I set the saturation of my shadows a little bit higher, and I set the saturation of my highlights just a little bit lower. So I'm making the color more saturated where it's dark and less saturated where it's bright. Now, like I said, there are all kinds of things you can do with color grading, but that's what I like to do. Another thing that you can do is if I come here under white balance, I can change the temperature of my scene. So right now it's kind of at an average temperature of 6500. But if I increase this value, you can see that my scene feels significantly warmer. And if I go under 6500, it feels significantly cooler. So this may be something that you could use if you wanted your scene to look like it's nighttime, for example, or if you wanted it to feel like warm and inviting and cheerful, you could increase the temperature here, and that gives you a significantly different looking scene. It really alters the overall mood of the scene when you adjust the temperature. I'm just going to leave it at 6500 for now, just the normal average standard temperature. Okay, next we're going to skip over film because I'm not going to use any of these features, but we are going to look at render features, and I want to show you the adjustments that I've made to ambient occlusion. So in order to see that better, I'm going to come over here under Lit and come to Buffer Visualization and pick Ambient Occlusion so we can isolate that and just look at ambient occlusion. So by default, the ambient occlusion intensity is, I think it's 0.5 and a radius of 100, or maybe a radius of 200. And this kind of depends on the size of the objects that you want to look at. In order to see this better, I'm going to set my intensity to 1 for now. So with this size, I'm getting kind of flat looking ambient occlusion, and so I'm going to turn my radius down to 50. And this kind of pulls out the shapes of my objects just a little bit more to emphasize the roundness of my rocks and to get a little bit more occlusion in the darker areas of my vegetation. So again, if I set this to 200 and intensity of 0.5, this is what Unreal gives us by default. And I'm going to leave the intensity of 0.5, but adjust my radius to 50 just to get a little bit more shape. And it's really subtle when I have my full lighting on. I don't know if you can even tell the difference between 50 and 200. It's a really subtle effect. But it does actually pull out a little bit more shape in my objects. I'm going to leave everything else in rendering features alone for now. And I think that's about it. So again, let's take a look at the post-process volume settings. If I turn them off and if I turn them on, so it kind of makes things feel a little bit more cinematic and increases contrast in my scene a little bit. It's hard to put my finger on exactly what it's doing or describe it well, but it makes the scene feel like it's being filmed with a real camera. And also the depth of field effects, if we look off into the distance, things in the foreground are sharp and things in the background are just a little bit blurry to kind of lead the eye of the player. All right, so today we went over post-process effects. We went over our reflection capturing, and we also went over just a little bit of light baking. Now, each of these topics has significantly more that you could learn about them, but I just wanted to touch on the basics today. I hope you enjoyed it and that you can see how much of a difference these elements make in the overall appearance of our scene. So again, here's what the scene looks like before we started working on it today, and here's what it looks like after. So some really cool touches with the reflections and with the post-process effects. So do some experimenting with these on your own, and let me know if you come up with some values that you like, and I'll see you in next week's video, everybody. Thanks for watching.